Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Just before we get stuck into this one, a little bit of news. I'm sorry part 5 was delayed, but I was writing a lot more parts because later this year we will be releasing STLs for the Rough and Readies and some additional characters as well. You'll be able to pick these up on my mini factory. It'll be a frontier, it'll be a whole thing. I've teamed up with like some fucking super talented and awesome people to get this done, and I'm very excited to slowly reveal things over the coming months. So for now, enjoy part 5. The formerly pristine marble of the hallways was covered in a thick layer of mold, slime, and decay. Even this far out from the heart of the city, from the central point of the festering rot that had usurped this place, not even the stone itself was free of the presence that had taken root here. Farooq reached out, gently touching his fingertips to the strangely warm stone, feeling the oily grime beneath his skin, then smelling it, drawing a deep breath in through his nose, imagining a molecular confusion in the spores as they entered his bloodstream. They would find themselves unable to enact any sickly mutation upon his flesh. However, the rank vileness of it had a familiarity to him, and he shut his eyes for just a second, blocking 10 centuries of unwanted memories from flooding his mind. He'd be happier when he was out of this place, but for now, there was business to attend to. To his right, the low loping strides of the werewolf were met with the slightly wet ticking of the beast's long nails against the marble of the floor. The flagstones here were covered in about half an inch of rank, fetid water, dripping down from the mold as a byproduct of whatever disgusting chemical and biological processes were taking place within it. The flesh of the beast's left side, neck, and arm still bore scarring from grenade shrapnel from a fight some months previously, but overall, the creature had proved to be a worthy asset. Farooq had been unsure about it at first, not quite enjoying the implication from being told to keep the beast close, especially as it wasn't under his direct control. It would do what he told it to, but its real loyalties were to the one who had forced Farooq to bring it on his current part of his centuries-long search in the first place. Farooq knew that if his erstwhile patron grew tired of him for any reason, the werewolf would be the thing that sent him back to hell. He also knew it would happen instantly if certain truths were ever to come to light, truths that Farooq worked very, very diligently to keep hidden. He was playing a very dangerous game, but nothing ever changed there. The strands of the web he had been weaving were all so delicate, and Farooq had set everything in motion so many times before that he had begun to believe his plans would never come to fruition. It was strange and terrifying and elating to think that he might be close to achieving his goal, a thing he had never dared whisper to another creature, living or damned, something he had tried to not even think about, lest there be a presence in his thoughts that he didn't even know was there. He longed to sit and consider the grand game he played, but there wasn't time, and it wasn't safe. He pushed such things from his mind, trying to focus on the task at hand. Walking along behind him were the unusual warriors of Beelzebub he had press-ganged into helping him. Crondel, the one who seemed to fancy himself as some sort of sea captain. He wasn't as insufferable as some of the servants of the Lord of the Flies, and he and his so-called crew would do for the task at hand. They were an oddly independent bunch, and while their obvious allegiance to Beelzebub through their Black Grail affection would allow them to survive this place, it was that independence that he needed. People who would follow his orders, but were removed enough from any of Beelzebub's efforts that they were expendable, and would raise no questions when they disappeared. Shrall and his squad, and the puppet boy that they refused to kill, were playing their part, gathering the bones as Farooq had been told they would. Yet this one, they would never be able to reach. If Farooq wanted them to get it, and he needed them to, he had no choice. He would have to go and get it for them. It stung him to stoop so low as to help a child of Antioch, but as long as the bone was here, the plan could never fully play out. His master's network of spies and contacts kept him well informed. Shrall had done well, with several of the bones already being collected. His squad had faced great odds, but coming here would be suicide. They'd be dead within moments if they attempted to step foot in the fallen city of Avignon. No, it would be up to Farooq and his motley band to take care of this. Suddenly, and as silently as a dream, a shape separated itself from the wall ahead of them, existence seeming to shift and bend around it as the grotesque man-thing dropped whatever mechanism it was that hid it from the world. Farooq personally didn't care to know how the infernal device implanted in the creature's back worked. He only cared that it did. The creature itself was an unusual one, present only at the will of their shared master, once again showing how important this undertaking was, and how everything had the potential to get out of control if Farooq wasn't careful. The armour of the chest was oddly angular, the helmet almost skull-capped. The arms were too long, ending in claws connected to poison delivery pumps hidden away in the shoulder pauldrons. Silenced pistols resided in those same gauntlets, further proof that the forces of hell had slowly been forced to adapt to the nature of this new war. "The way is clear," the thing said, the voice distorted and guttural, as if forced from behind jaws that rarely moved by a tongue that rarely shaped words. With that, Farooq felt the wrench and twist in his stomach as he watched the being once again disappear. He had heard of the death commandos and their deeds countless times, but seeing one slip in and out of apparent existence at will was something he hoped to never have to witness again. Farooq, himself a creature of the abyss that God had forsaken, would never admit that some monsters scared even him, but he couldn't hide from that fact in the privacy of his own head. "You've got more connections than you let on. What exactly has sent us on this merry little chase?" asked Crondall, remembering to keep his voice low as Farooq had instructed. "That is not your concern. Your only worry should be that we get out of here and back to the boat when I have what I need." Farooq's words were sharp and icy, and Crondall sulked along beside him at the apparent disrespect, but said nothing else. He led them down a maze of corridors, and from time to time they passed evidence of the Death Commando's bloody work. Fly thralls lay eviscerated on the ground, or headless, or just scattered in pieces. Lumps of rancid and infected flesh splashed across the walls, or lying pathetically in the fetid water. Each one had been killed before it stood a chance of leaving its post and getting word to anyone else. They had never even made a sound before they died. Farooq's instructions to the Death Commando had been clear. Kill them before they can so much as flap a wing, lest that itself be a signal to the rest of the vile things that live in this thrice-cursed city. If there was one thing Farooq hated, it was cities. Ugly places, piles of stone and dirt, where filthy humans lived amidst their own vomitus and shit. He was at home in the deep deserts, where he had been born, where the sun and the dry air would draw the life out of a man foolish enough to think he was more powerful than them. Farooq had been sired amidst the dunes, and had been raised by a cult of blades, taught the old names and the old ways. He was a child of the sands, and had roamed there before the owner of this ruined city had even been known as Baal. He continued on through the outer walls of Avignon, the werewolf by his side, and Crondall and his crew close behind. The Plague Knight was trying to stay uncomfortably close to Farooq, and he couldn't quite figure out what the creature's interest in him was, but at least the idiot musician wasn't trying to play anything on that damnable music box of his. When they had first slipped from the dark boats that had carried him up the Rhone, He had childishly squeezed out another two before Farooq had pinned him to the wall, hand wrapped around his face, squeezing until he started to feel the thing's jaw slide ever so slowly out of its socket. "Play that thing again, and I'll make you wish you were back in hell," he had spat. Putting up with the odd habits of this strange group was worth it, because he could not deny that they were effective and, when properly instructed, stealthy. They had made it into the city without notice from either the various forces of New Antioch, who kept seemingly constant patrol in the area, or the actual inhabitants of filth-ridden Avignon. Farooq could not imagine all the tiny strings of influence and fortune at play here. How much energy and effort was being burned to make a bird caw or a branch fall so that a guard in a watchtower miles away was distracted for just a moment while they moved from the river to the dark tunnels beneath the city. While he shuddered in disgust at the thought of having a master, he could not deny the incredible power and influence that his same master enjoyed. This entire enterprise was monstrous in scale and delicate in nature, kept in motion only because the moving pieces knew little but their own aims and instructions. It was only Farooq who knew what everything led to. Farooq, who was as old as the desert sands, who had plucked lost Templars from the swirling agony of the gates before anyone else had cared that they were there at all. Farooq, the eternal slave to the intentions of another. He tried to let the inner voices go, aware that his one advantage over the rest of his kind was his ability to do just that. To ignore the worst parts of himself and focus instead on the reality of things. But it was hard. Trapped in this city, forced to scurry through the waste of the pretender Beelzebub, to do the work that weak men couldn't. It burned him. Before he knew it, they had come to a massive chamber, deep beneath the spoiled city. This place had been there long before the Fly Lord's missionaries had infested this place, and he doubted if a living soul still knew that it existed. The secret of this place had been lost when the pig pope had opened the gates, and the filth had flooded in. The rough-hewn room was nearly 40 feet wide, running 50 feet deep before stopping abruptly at a harsh stone wall. "Watch the door. If anyone comes, kill them," Farooq said as he strode toward the center of the room. He was not expecting company, as it had been a while since they had passed a dead thrall. They couldn't guard corridors that they did not know existed, but Farooq was ever cautious. He whistled low to the werewolf, and it ticked over on the hard stone floor as Crondell and his crew set up on either side of the door, weapons ready, just in case they were disturbed. Kneeling down in the center of the room, he scraped away at centuries of dust and dirt and detritus on the floor until he revealed a large tile with channels carved into it. They formed complex geometries that Farooq couldn't follow, but he wouldn't need to. He held his arm above the tile, taking his dagger and cutting deeply into the flesh, causing his blood to run freely and splash down onto the floor. He signaled to the werewolf, and the creature held out a long, distended limb, and once again the dagger cut deep, eliciting a low growl from the creature. "The blood of a man and the blood of a demon," Farooq said. "Now for the final tumbler." He reached into the lush cloth of his cloak and from a secret pocket pulled a clay vial. The vial itself was jet black, born of the clay from the banks of the Lathe. The wax that sealed it was a murky crimson colour. He gently used his dagger to pierce the seal, then held the vial above the carved tile. The blood of the divine. He did not know which recluse the blood came from, only that it must be from one of those who had fallen and refused to change. They were hidden somewhere beneath the plains of hell, Arakiel, Armoros, and Shamsiel, wandering a labyrinth of guilt and shame, that had no exit and no end. As he turned the vial, a single drop of blood fell from it, and for just a moment, in its presence, Farooq felt the terrible caustic burning of the reality that he had turned from the light of God. The werewolf staggered back as if struck by a blow, but Farooq stayed where he was, refusing to be cowed by a being whose entire existence was now nothing but painful guilt of their own failures and weakness. The feeling faded the moment the drop of blood landed into the pooled blood below it, mixing with the others and becoming sullied and unclean. For a moment, nothing else happened, but soon the blood, which had spilled and splattered all over the tile, began to heave and ooze, becoming thick and viscous as it rolled and slopped its way into the carved channels. As the last inch of the channel was filled, the blood seemed to harden and crystallized, looking almost like ruby, and Farooq had but a brief moment to admire it before the tile beneath it cracked, as if it had been shattered by a massive hammer. Farooq managed to shield himself from the worst of the shrapnel, but he felt sharp shards of stone cutting through the flesh of his arms, the power released by the mixtures of blood throwing him 10 feet through the air, landing unceremoniously on the hard stone floor. The dreadful noise of the explosions meant he could only hear a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He started to crawl toward the tile to grab what should have been exposed by the mixture of blood beneath it, but before he got more than a few painful steps, he knew that something had gone awfully wrong. Where there should have been a simple hole through to a chamber below, instead there was a strange and terrible membrane of flesh, stretched taut and thin across a pool of bubbling blood. Near the entrance, Crondall and the rest were in various states of disarray, some holding their heads or bleeding from small wounds where the stone had reached even them. Farooq managed to get to his feet, and only then did he realize that as the blood from the multitude of wounds hit the ground, it was pulled like a marble into the membrane. He stared at the ground beneath the crumpled werewolf and saw the creature's blood running towards the pit as well, and he realized that the tile and blood spell had not been a portal spell as he had been told. It was a summoning spell. As he realized it, something began to push against the membrane, slowly rising out of the pit of blood that bubbled and boiled beneath. The shape coming up from the crimson pool was skeletal, all angular bone and hard edges. Farooq slowly backed away, uncertain about what was occurring. He had been promised access to the artifact, a portal leading to the item that he sought, not this. As he watched, the shape spun and twisted ever so slowly, like an urn upon a potter's wheel, and with a delicacy that belied the horror of it, the layer of skin was wrapped around it, and beneath that same skin the blood rushed and oozed, forming meat and matter, growing into tendons and ligaments, attaching to the bones like sickly maggots crawling across some ivory armature. As the form took shape, arms and legs became decipherable, and Farooq's gaze shifted to where the werewolf was finally stirring on the ground. The beast had been hit in the chest by a massive shard of bone, a gaping wound hanging open, revealing the pale white bone of ribs and sternum. He stared again at the form that coalesced in front of him, the same long limbs beginning to fill in, and was just about to shout to Crondall when one massive wing seemed to explode from the creature's back. It was covered in downy feathers that fell away like snow, only to grow back almost instantly, and within the creases of the flesh, dozens of eyes blinked and stared around madly. Farooq could only watch as the eyes detached from their places in the wing, sliding across the pale pink surface of the newly formed beast's exposed flesh. They moved to different points on the shoulders, chest, arms and legs, then split, each singular eye forming a pair. A soft curve of nose formed beneath them, then a mouth, and before he knew what was happening, Farooq was staring at dozens and dozens of his own face, growing within the flesh of the beast. Each wore a different expression, some raging, others weeping, yet more laughing, but their mummery was voiceless, which somehow made it worse. The beast threw back its head and howled, and finally Farooq could see, buried in the flesh of its chest, beneath the neck, an oddly honeycombed and porous shard of bone that he was here to get. He pulled his shotgun from beneath his robe, sending a blast of buckshot from it into the monster at the exact moment that Crondall fired from the other side. Crondall's thralls moved from the doorway to try to swarm the beast, and a swipe of its claws took off 2 of their heads with ease. Farooq fired again, blowing a huge chunk of flesh out of the beast's right thigh, and then the werewolf and Plague Knight were upon it. The razor-sharp saws buried in the werewolf's face caught the beast in the midsection, right as the Plague Knight ran it through with her sword. The beast just roared, using one hand to lift the werewolf and send it flying across the room to smash into the wall near the entrance, while the other backhanded the Plague Knight, forming a huge dent where it caved in her chestplate and sent her clattering across the floor. She came to a stop in a crumpled heap, and then didn't move again. Farooq fired twice more as the remaining thralls swarmed the creature, and got in one last shot when Blubbermaw, the idiot musician, crashed into it, using his shield as a form of battering ram. He took the legs out from under it, both of them crashing to the now solid ground beneath the monstrosity. The ritual magic was all used up, and the beast was finally fully formed, but already injured. Still, it moved like a blur, burying claws from one hand into Blubbermaw's gut, throwing him away as the entrails fell across the floor, leaving a sickly trail of viscera behind. Nearly all the thralls were dead now. The Plague Knight and Werewolf both seemed out of the fight. Blubbermaw was likely dead, and just Crondall and Farooq remained at either side of the demon. It managed to get back to its feet, but limped heavily, and Farooq wondered if the powerful corpse guard had managed to break its leg. Farooq had not expected to face a ritual beast like this, and had no idea how strong it might be, or if it would dissipate in time. He could not afford to wait, as if the beast faded back to ether as the magic used to form it faded, it would surely take the artifact with it. This had been the true protection for the artifact, a creature born of all the blood that was used to summon it. He had no idea who had hidden it here, or how they held the power to create such a trap, but he was in it now. Crondall fired again from behind the creature, the infested ammo from his shotgun tearing at the flesh, but failing to do any real damage. The beast turned on Crondall, lashing out at him, but he was surprisingly light on his feet, and danced away from the blow with a grace that surprised Farooq. Even so, this was a lopsided battle. The powerful demon only needed to hit them once to cripple them and take them out of the fight, while it barely seemed to notice the damage that had already been done to it. Farooq and Crondall fired and dodged around the beast again, trading its attentions by inflicting what little pain on it they could, but time was running out, and Farooq could already see the beast was starting to lose its hold on the physical plane. Just as he thought that all was lost, the werewolf came barreling into the creature from behind, and the Death Commando appeared out of empty space in front of it, burying its brutal claws so deep in the beast's stomach that his forearms disappeared inside of it. The wicked saws of the werewolf burst out of the creature's chest, and it screamed, the dreadful cacophony of it echoing on off the walls of the room. Both Crondall and Farooq fell upon the monster, emptying their shotguns into it while it thrashed around, the wolf and Death Commando tearing at it like rabid animals. Chunks of rancid demonic flesh fell from it, and blood ran from it in rivers, but it showed no sign of losing its prodigious strength. A wing lashed out and hit Farooq, sending him sailing across the room, shattering his right arm and dislocating his shoulder. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, his shotgun flying and more bones breaking. For a moment, the world went dark, and it was only his will that stopped his body from passing out. He staggered back to his feet, vomiting as his head swam, the distant walls of the room seeming to breathe and twist. He didn't want to go back into the fight. He just wanted to slink away into the dark and leave this scene of failure behind him. But he couldn't. Even with so much risk to the one thing he valued, he had to get that bone. That's when it struck him, and he grabbed his dagger with his left hand, screaming at the others to hold the beast in place as best they could. The werewolf roared, grabbing the thing around its waist and pushing it across the room until they both smashed into the wall. The muscles beneath the werewolf's fur bunched and rippled from the effort, and Farooq was sure the creature would tear itself to pieces sooner than let the monster go. Even now, Farooq suspected their master whispered in its ear, letting it know the price of failure. Crondall and the Death Commando each grabbed a wing, pinning them to the wall, and Farooq scurried amongst them all like a thief, plunging his dagger into the creature's chest, sawing viciously at the meat that held the bone. He felt the creature's arms smashing into him, tearing at his flesh, but he ignored the pain of it all, finally wrenching the artifact from the monster's chest and staggered backwards, falling to the hard stone floor. In front of him, pinned to the wall, whatever power and will had kept the chimera alive abandoned it, and it began to shrink and ooze, spilling out of itself like a burst dam. Crondall and the Death Commando dived away from it, but the werewolf saw nothing more than a feast, tearing at the dissolving flesh with its barbed mouth, taking in great gulps of the decaying flesh. Farooq lay on the floor and tried to assess the damage to himself. Between the shattered arm, dislocated shoulder, some broken ribs, and some giant gashes where the demon had torn at him, he was in a bad way. But there was only pain. He didn't think he had been injured to the point where this body would cease to function, and that was all that mattered. Slowly, he got to his feet, feeling the blood running into his robes, but more than anything, feeling the odd, porous surface of the artifact in his hand. He looked down at it and wondered what it must be like to be the creature that this thing came from, how impossible an existence, and how tragic. He brushed such thoughts from his mind, already feeling the skin of his back and sides starting to close. The broken bones would take longer, and even the dislocated shoulder would soon reset itself, but eventually his many gifts would stitch his body back together. Crondall was walking between his fallen comrades, and Farooq was surprised to see that both the corpse guard and the plague knight still lived. Beelzebub's creatures were tough, and only the thralls would not be waking their way back to the ship. That complicated things a little, as Crondall would have been easier to deal with on his own, but even injured, he was confident that he, the werewolf, and the Death Commando could take care of the captain and his crew. As useful as they were still enslaved to the Pretender, and they could not be allowed to leave this place. They would be a suitable escort back to the boat and away from Avignon, but he'd make sure the waters of the Rhone were their final resting place. The werewolf finished eating, seemingly full from feasting on the dead beast, but a great slab of its flesh still hung from its chest, only held in place by one of the thick strips of armor that were bolted in place. It trotted over to Farooq, seemingly wanting some signal of a job well done, and the man took a moment to pat the beast on the head, wanting to laugh at the ridiculousness of the gesture. They gathered up their fallen weapons, then made ready to journey back through the tunnels to the hidden dock they had arrived at. They were just a few 100 meters from the spot where the hidden tunnel joined back with the main structure of the rancid city when they heard it. It was gentle at first, then seemed to grow louder with each step. The sound didn't so much as bounce off the thick stone walls as seemed to make them vibrate gently, and Farooq knew that they were in terrible trouble. Coming down the tunnels was the sound of millions of flies.